My name is John Massey. I worked very closely with Green Power Academy for a number of years, including developing and continuing to present this, the Renewable Mini MBA program, as well as running my own little company as shown on the screen. The idea of today is really to ask this question, what factors determine the right new power generation mix? And I chose that question because it gives quite a good general sense of the range of issues, the range of factors that we discuss and also model and put some numbers on and so on within the mini MBA program. And you'll notice that I've got the word right in quotation marks, which kind of should already give you a sense as to what the answer is, and the answer, as with most of these things, is it depends. The short answer is there's no single best answer to this as to what the right power generation mix is for any particular market. So a good place to start is just thinking, well, what do we want our power generation mix to do? So why does the electricity system even exist in the first place? And very simple statement, the whole point of the electricity system is to basically match supply of electricity with demand for electricity. So it's got to provide the right amount of power at exactly the right time. And there are obviously a whole bunch of different ways to do that, which make up this thing that we call the power generation mix. And each of those different ways to do it have different implications in terms of things like performance, depending how you regard that, in terms of things like impact on cost, on the country in general, on the world, climate, and so on and so on. And depending where you're coming from, depending what your job is, depending who you work for, a whole bunch of different factors, you might have a different view on what the best thing to do is. So we're mainly going to focus in this little webinar around supply. And in particular, one of the points I wanted to make right from the start is that supply is a very diverse set of options. I've tried to list, I think I've pretty much covered all of them on the slide here. So I'm listing different sources of power generation down the side, and then I've got various attributes along the top, which I'll explain. I'll sort of work my way through this slide as we go along. Okay, so at the top of the slide, working down, oil, coal, gas. They're obviously our fossil fuel sources. Nuclear and hydro, I guess, would be the other two that would make up what you might regard as kind of conventional power, certainly until relatively recent times. Those top five are the ones that would make up the bulk of any power generating mix. And then below that, biomass down through to solar are what most people would regard as the renewable power options. So rather more recent additions to the mix, although in some cases things like geothermal has been around for an awful long time. So again, we'll get back to some of the differences between these. At the bottom, again, I'll come back to this idea of, I put storage on here. As anyone that saw my storage markets webinar or has been on the storage course, storage isn't just a matter of supply, but I'll come back to why I've added storage onto this chart. So I've got different columns. A first question to ask if we're looking at coming up with a new power generation mix, and in particular if we're looking at renewable power, is well what do we count as renewable? Now I'm clearly saying oil, coal and gas, anything that you have to kind of dig out of the ground and burn, that's certainly not renewable. Nuclear as well, nuclear fuel, once you've used it, then once you've generated as much as you can out of it, then it's obviously non-renewable. Now there are plenty of people that would argue that if you do nuclear fuel recycling potentially in future, in effect the volumes of fuel that you require to produce amounts of electricity make it on a reasonable timescale a fairly good supply. You're not going to run out. It certainly wouldn't regard as renewable. My definition of renewable, if you like, is that can you is there more of it available as fast as you use it up? Hydro, now the next three I've kind of put in brackets. Hydro, biomass and geothermal would certainly, I think for most people, be regarded as renewable power sources. Hydro, again, to follow my definition, as long as there's water falling fast enough at the top as you use it, pull it out through a turbine at the bottom, then that's renewable. Now, an issue with hydro is that then depends very much on the water cycle, the climate and the market that you're in. There will be some times of year when you have to reduce your output because there's water's not falling fast enough at the top of the hill as it's coming down the river or through the hydro scheme at the bottom of the hill. So there might be some seasonal issues about how quickly you can use that water, how much power you can generate to keep that system being renewable. The same is true of geothermal. With geothermal, we're clearly not going to run out of heat from the interior of the earth anytime soon by just drawing out a little bit at the top to make electricity. But certainly on a local scale, there are examples of geothermal power plants where when people have tried to be a bit greedy about how quickly they draw power out, they see the output of the plant drop, because locally you do see it's generally not a reduction in temperature, it's a reduction in water pressure and hence flow rate. So you do see a reduction in your ability to pull energy out of the ground as fast as it can renew itself underneath on a local scale. And biomass, there's lots of controversy around biomass. Again, to use my simple definition, I guess you'd be looking at, can we grow it as fast as you burn it? And so again, it's very debatable in many cases to whether that's true. Biomass covers a huge range, anything from waste to energy. You could argue if we're producing waste anyway, then we may as well use it, to fuel crops, which become a bit more controversial. And then below that, we've got things like tidal wave, wind and solar, which by pulling a bit of wind out the air or grabbing some photons as they land on the earth, we're not exhausting them. There's more along in a minute, if you like. So we've got even simple definition of renewable. There are some that are clearly not renewable, and there are some that clearly are, and then there are one or two that might be renewable if you don't use them too quickly and depending on kind of local factors. So renewable power, non-renewable power, that's hopefully fairly clear. There are some other important distinctions. If we skip to the middle for the moment, one of the rationales around coming up with a new power mix is to reduce carbon emissions. And certainly the general idea is that renewable power is carbon-free power. Now you'll notice again, I've kind of bracketed biomass in the middle of there. Again, that's quite a controversial area of study. I'm certainly not going to get into it in any detail here as to whether biomass power is truly carbon neutral in terms of emissions. And with CO2 here, what I'm talking about is carbon dioxide emitted during the operations of the power plant. I'm not talking about the whole life cycle carbon emissions balance in terms of things like manufacturing and so on as well. Again, there's some people have different views around that, but certainly in terms of emissions during operation, oil, coal and gas, hydrocarbon fuels, as you burn them, CO2 and water, so carbon emitting. Biomass depends on the supply chain and the crop that you're talking about. Now this obviously is where things like nuclear stand out. We're not calling it renewable power. People object to nuclear for all sorts of other reasons, but one reason why you might want to look at it, and certainly be worthy of consideration if carbon emissions is one of your key priorities, is that it doesn't emit any carbon in usage. And then obviously hydro, of the conventional power generating sources, the ones that have been around for a while, is obviously doesn't emit any carbon. So nuclear and hydro, good mix if you're looking at carbon free. And then the various other renewables, geothermal down to solar, obviously not carbon emitting sources. So if we're looking, as many countries are, at more renewables and lower carbon power, then you're probably starting to look towards the bottom of the chart rather than the top. So this is where we start to get into some of the other points on here, because there are certainly some compromises to be made. Thermal is kind of an interesting one. Again, very dependent on what your needs are, what your market situation is. Oil, coal, gas, biomass, geothermal, clues in the name, and nuclear are all actually, those fuels are all ultimately ways to produce heat. So primarily all of those technologies first and foremost produce heat, and then we choose, there's no law that says we have to, but we choose to use that heat to spin a generator to produce electricity. Now there are a few things that come out of that. One is that if you're in a market where heat is important, then those power generating sources also are heat generating sources. So for example, in places like Denmark, Germany, where there's good sized district heating systems, one advantage of using thermal type of power generation is that not only can you add to your power generating mix, but you can also add to your heat generating mix. And in particular, if you're looking to decarbonize that by removing coal, gas, oil, whatever is being used, then one way to do that is to use something like biomass or geothermal heat source instead. Now that obviously competes, and this is where you get into, again, complexity within the whole mix and the competitive environment. You could argue that competes with the electrification of heat. So there's different ways you could do heat, but certainly one of them is to use a thermal power generating source and make use of that heat, because otherwise that's waste heat. One of the challenges around thermal power generation, particularly if we look at those top three in particular, where those fuels may be relatively expensive for you to buy. They might be largely imported, so there's energy security issues. When you burn them, you only generate electricity at a relatively low efficiency. Most of the fuel that you're putting in to your power plant is just being used to heat the sky, unless you have some kind of combined heat and power usage for that. So using heat is not only a better use of any fuel that you do put in, but also if you're in a market where heat is important, it's an extra service, it's an extra part of the energy mix, not just the power mix that you can use. And I've talked about heating. Anything where you need heat, you can also use that to produce cooling by technologies such as absorption chilling. So where you read thermal, you could potentially also look at hot environments where cooling demand is very large, and look at ways of using that heat to generate a cooling cycle. So another aspect of our conventional power plants, which has become actually had quite a lot of mention recently, is in terms of grid integration. And a term you may hear more frequently is this term inertia. Inertia is basically around the fact that large power plants, big thermal power plants with spinning generators to produce power, those spinning generators are big heavy chunks of machinery. They're synchronized with the grid frequency. If there are problems in the grid, they have a certain amount of inertia that can help the grid frequency stay where it's supposed to be. It's a very very simplistic way of describing it, but inertia is a whole topic in itself. But certainly that's one aspect of grid reliability which conventional thermal generators, and also renewable thermal generators such as biomass and geothermal, anything that has a big spinning generator involved, inertia potentially going forwards is quite an important part of, if not the energy mix of your system, certainly the reliability and the integration bit of the mix, in a way that technologies which put power into the grid via an inverter, things like solar and wind, don't have that same mass of spinning generator that provides a kind of physical inertia. There are, again, we could talk about synthetic inertia in more detail, and there are other ways potentially to replicate that. So thermal is a bit different. Now, thermal generation to a large extent goes along with fuel. Mainly we're producing heat by burning fuel. So our fourth column there looks at the types of generator which involve fuel. Clearly oil, coal, gas, nuclear and biomass all involve fuel. Now there are pros and cons obviously to fuel. As we've said, there are pros and cons with being thermal or not. A big advantage of a generating source which requires fuel is that you can locate the power plant where it makes most sense in terms of supply and demand, i.e. you can build it close to where people live, and you can move the fuel to the power plant. Whereas if you're building something like solar and wind, you can't grab some sunshine and move it to a power plant and build your power plant where it makes most sense, closest to demand, for example. If the best solar resource is out in the desert, that may not be where most people live. And so either you've got to build it out in the desert to get the most power out of it and then build a long grid connection potentially to get it back to centres of demand, or you've got to compromise and maybe not build it in what is the best resource location, but balance that against the costs of getting the electricity to where it needs to be. Whereas if you've got a fuel which you can move about, you can build your power plant where it makes most sense, and then you can move the fuel to it. The other thing you can also do with a fuel, and in particular here we're talking about oil, but potentially gas, is you can move the fuel about with your power generation, or with your not so much power generation, but your energy use. What I'm talking about here in a rather waffly way is transport. So I can have a tank of petrol or a tank of diesel, or if I'm on a boat, a big tank of horrible bunker oil, and that can come along with me and generate power, generate energy when I need it. Now, again, the alternative to that, if we're talking about transport, is to electrify transport and have batteries which move about, but we're certainly not going to be generating enough solar power from the roof of a car to move it very far. There's simply not enough space. So fuel has a couple of advantages because it's mobile. You can move it as you go along, or you can move it to a centralized location and put that centralized location where it makes most sense, again in terms of this idea of matching supply and demand. And as I say, fuel goes quite closely with the thermal part of it. Now there's obviously various downsides on thermal. One of the downsides that I didn't mention as I went along was the need for cooling. If we're generating power through a thermal cycle, a part of that thermal cycle is that we cool basically the exhaust from the turbine. We have to actively cool it. Now that again may be limited in markets where the temperature is very high, where you don't have access to water, for example. Basically the more you can cool the far side of the power cycle, the more efficient that cycle will be. If you are building a plant somewhere where you don't have much access for water, you can use things like air cooling or various hybrid systems, but the efficiency will tend to be lower. You may get lower efficiency from your power plant at hotter times of year than cooler times of year if you're using that kind of method. With fuel, now again, there's a disparity here between the things at the top which use fuel and the things that we've marked at the bottom that we've called renewable. An advantage of renewables which don't use fuel is that once you've built them, you pretty much know the cost of your system for however long you think it's going to last. With fuel, if you have to keep providing that on an operational basis, you have an operational cost. And if I just flick to another slide, the challenge there is that the cost of fuel can be rather scarily variable. So this was just historical data looking back over a 15-year period. It's all indexed back to April 2001. And you can see that there have been some very large-scale changes. Basically, the price of fuels all kind of started shooting up until the financial crash. Then some of them started shooting up again a little bit after the financial crash, apart from shale gas in the US, which kept quite low. And then actually at the moment, we're in a period where fuel prices are relatively low. But it's a kind of brave man or woman who is going to confidently predict for the next 15 or 20 years, or whatever the lifetime of your power plant is, what the fuel price is going to look like. And so what that introduces, if you're looking at fuel-powered generators, is you've got a forward price risk, which you don't have in things like wind and solar, and potentially in future, things like tidal and wave. Okay, and then we get to a couple more columns over here on the right, which look slightly complex. I maybe deal with the right-hand one first. C factor, capacity factor. Capacity factor is, for those of you unfamiliar with it, it's basically a metric that tells you for the amount of capacity, megawatts you build, how many megawatt hours, how much energy you'll get out of the capacity that you've built. 100% capacity factor means that, in effect, you can run the power plant at full power all the time. So higher capacity factor is good in the sense of every dollar you spend building capacity, you get more energy out to sell. So potentially your business case looks quite nice. Now, capacity factor depends on, again, the type of supply source you're using. If you're using a source involving fuel, then for the most part, what that means is that the capacity factor of your plant is going to depend on how often you choose to use it. And that's because you can choose not to generate, or you can choose to generate, because you can decide when to put fuel in or out of the plant. And the reason you might choose not to generate is if, relative to the price of the fuel that you're going to set fire to and get rid of, the electricity price is low, it may be more profitable not to run. You may only want to run a plant which uses expensive fuel or burns it inefficiently, such as open cycle gas plant here in Europe, on a very relatively few hours of the year. And what that means is you'll probably charge quite a lot when you do. That's where we get into the whole peak pricing issue. So things like oil, coal, gas, biomass, because you can choose whether or not you're going to burn a fuel, your capacity factor can vary enormously depending on how the economics of your plant fits into the system you're a part of. Now, nuclear uses a fuel. In theory, you can ramp nuclear up and down. In practice, because the cost structure of nuclear is such that you've got a huge capital cost and a very relatively tiny fuel cost, it just doesn't make much economic sense to ramp nuclear up and down. Depending on the type of technology, you can't ramp it up and down quickly anyway, although again you'd read various things about the technical capabilities of nuclear, and in some cases there's certainly the technical ability to ramp up and down at relatively significant rates, but the economics just don't make sense. If you're paying back your capital, you're going to have to do that whether you run or not, so you may as well run more often than not. For the other types of supply, the ones that rely on nature, then clearly your capacity factor is not something that you choose. How often your plant operates and produces power and at what level depends on how windy it is or how sunny it is, what the waves are like. In hydro, what the water resource is like. Has it rained a lot recently? Was there high snow melt in the spring? Whatever the local reason may be. And so you'll find hydro varies enormously from country to country. In some countries, hydro can operate a good chunk of the time at very high capacity factor. In some countries, like here in the UK, it may operate at relatively small levels as a kind of peaking resource. Things like the other renewables, though, geothermal, if you drilled a big expensive hole in the ground to pull up hot water, the water isn't hot 1 minute and cold the next. So you should be able to run geothermal at a nice steady output. So you'll end up with a good high capacity factor. I'm not a big fan of terms like baseload power, but if you are, geothermal would be the kind of baseload type generator that you could use. Whereas things like wind and solar, particularly because they're the biggest installed bases in terms of renewables. Wind, offshore, there are offshore wind sites and 1 or 2 onshore wind sites now that are getting up to kind of 50% capacity factor. There are sites certainly here and certainly older ones which might be down at 25% capacity factor. For solar PV particularly, which is by far the biggest chunk of the market, you're really looking at less than 25% even in good areas. There are 1 or 2 rare examples, depends if you're using things like tracking or not, where you might get up to 30% if you're lucky. But effectively, a key difference between wind and solar and, for example, something like nuclear, if we're looking at, well, what are our options in terms of low carbon electricity, capacity factor is a key difference. To generate the same amount of energy over a period of time, if you're building generators of low capacity factor, you'll need to build a lot of capacity of them. And again, that produces some potentially challenging outcomes. Again, if I just flick to an example. So this is just an example of capacity factors and supply mix. This is the UK. It was taking a particular week back in February 2016. You can see that nuclear at the bottom runs at a very steady level. Actually, the capacity factor there looks relatively low, not because all plants were running at only kind of 4/5 of their capacity, but actually I think 1, maybe 2 plants were just out of operation entirely for maintenance and so on. But nuclear kind of chunters along all day and all night at a steady level. Wind, which is the kind of light blue colour there, on that particular week, over the week had a pretty low capacity factor, only just over 20%. And it sort of did its own thing. You can see at the start of the week and the end of the week, it was relatively high. There was a period in the middle of the week when you were getting almost nothing out of your wind capacity. And then as we move kind of up that energy mix stack, combined cycle gas, which is in the yellow. In the UK, it's gas which really does all the flexibility. It's gas that kind of fills the gap between the stuff stacked up at the bottom and the big changes in demand that you see each day and across the week. So over this particular week, the capacity factor of the combined gas turbine fleet was about 46%, and that's simply because that was what made that was, if you like, the amount of energy that was required to fill that gap between the other sources and demand, and just because of the economics of when to burn gas relative to, for example, coal in the dark brown on this slide. So gas was a kind of economic choice, the capacity factor. Nuclear, in effect, was an economic choice because it makes sense to just run it all the time. Wind was a function of the natural resource. Now, the challenge, of course, with capacity factor differences, as I mentioned, was that if you have to build lots of capacity to generate the same amount of energy over a period of time, then there are occasions when you can end up with too much. Again, 2016, this was a Christmas week in Germany. The wind contribution to the energy mix, the power mix here is in the green colour, little bit of solar. This was over kind of a 3-day period. And then the conventional stuff is in the grey. Now, basically these 3 days over Christmas week, there was an awful lot of wind energy. And so in Germany, what you end up with on days, increasingly when you have lots of wind energy, is that you can end up with negative prices. So on this chart, the axis on the left is showing the power, how much power you're getting from each of the sources. The one on the right is showing the price, and that's referring to those kind of spiky red and blue lines, which are both showing different. There's a 15-minute price and an average, sort of continually averaged 15-minute price. But basically, when you've got situations of low demand and lots of wind in Germany, you're ending up with negative prices. And it's not just Germany. We've seen this with solar energy in California now. We've seen it also with solar energy, bizarrely, for a country like the UK, which people don't really think of sunny. We've seen it here with too much sun. Hard to believe that may be. So that's one chart, and one of the reasons actually why you end up with negative prices, even though you can see that there's no point on here where wind is fully making up that stack of power supply, is that you have some resources which have to run in the system. So you've got nuclear, which doesn't really want to turn down. And you're probably also running some coal, and in terms of both coal and nuclear, part of the reasons that some of these plants have to run is back to things like inertia that we've talked about. It's about not supplying energy or power, it's about keeping the grid operating reliably. So this a mix of still having some of these big rotating synchronous generators in the system. If you skip forward a couple of weeks from that previous chart, there was 3 days here where you hardly had any wind. So you've just got this little thin green strip across the top. You've got to fill your demand then with conventional power. So it means you've still got to have your conventional resource available to provide enough capacity. And what happens there is at times of high demand, those conventional generators kind of fill their boots in terms of revenue generation, and you end up with very high prices. So one of the consequences that we're starting to see in systems where you've got a mix of low capacity factor resources, renewable resources, low carbon resources, and still quite big chunks of conventional power, and especially where you've got a lack of flexibility in being able to turn some of that conventional power on and off, and you still need it to meet demand, is that you can see big impacts on pricing, from negative prices on the one hand to very large price spikes and peak prices on the other hand. Okay. And so that's kind of brought us on to flexibility. Again, a slightly confusing system of ticks and crosses here, but I'll just briefly go through them. Basically, more ticks on my charts means sort of nominally more flexible resource. And so things like, as we saw in the UK, gas is a very flexible resource. You can turn it up and down relatively quickly. Again, depends slightly on the cycle. Is it combined cycle or open cycle? Coal tends to do so a little more slowly. Nuclear, I mean, again, I've said no. I've put a cross against flexibility. Now, again, nuclear proponents will be sort of potentially banging at their screen saying, but you can turn it up and down. Again, this is not so much driven by a technical capability, but if you look at what happens in real markets, and you think about the economics of nuclear, particularly if you're building new nuclear, if you go to an investor and say, okay, we want you to build nuclear, but we might have to turn you up and down, you're going to have a problem, because there's a big chunk of capital cost that's sitting there needing to be paid, and the fuel cost, which allows this kind of price taking, if you like, simply isn't there. Of the renewables, of the kind of low carbon stuff, the other low carbon stuff, hydro, very, very flexible. If you've got good hydro resource in your market, then you're lucky. You've got a nice flexible resource. And it's no surprise actually that if you look at markets which have very high percentages of renewables, or report very high percentages of renewables, and potentially have also very high percentages of wind and solar in them, In many cases, in fact, I would say in most cases, you'll find that hydro is a big part of being able to balance that. In the case of Denmark, the hydro doesn't have to be in the same country. You can have very high wind resource, but as long as you've got a connection to somewhere else that has the flexibility, in this case, say Norway, with lots of hydropower, it's a great balance for the inflexibility of things like wind and solar, which kind of produce when they want to produce. Biomass, obviously, because you can choose when or when not to burn a fuel in the same way as you can with other conventional fossil sources, has some degree of flexibility. Again, it can be anything from coal-like to gas-like, depending on whether we're talking about burning wood pellets or whether we're talking about something like biogas. So obviously biomass covers a kind of whole range of different things. Geothermal, I mean, a bit like nuclear, really. You could, in theory, turn your turbines down if you wanted to. In practice, though, if you've drilled a big deep hole in the ground and there's nice hot water available to come out of it under pressure, why would you? If you look at the economics and you run kind of cash flow projections for geothermal, to get the business case to stack up, given the costs of drilling and construction and so on in the first place, is to run it at high capacity factor. So again, theoretically some flexibility, but in practice you'd want to run that at high capacity factor. You'd want to run it in a fairly baseload manner. Tidal, wave, wind and solar, because they're all driven by nature, are inherently inflexible. I've kind of given tidal, again, a very bracketed tick on the basis that there are designs of tidal barrage, tidal lagoon that people are looking at, where you wouldn't necessarily have to take the maximum power output at the peak of tide. You can store, and then you have some control over when you do and don't release that head of water that you've collected. But obviously wind, solar, without other things in place, and this is where we get to the line at the bottom, are inherently inflexible. They produce when nature says it's available. Just to summarize up flexibility, bear in mind that flexibility is not just about supply. So having what I've called here on the third line quickly dispatchable power plants is one source of flexibility, but there are others as well. I mentioned Denmark. Interconnection with other power systems is a big potential source of flexibility, and in effect that's achieving the top one, which is to have a bigger system, a bigger balancing area, so more choices, more options of both supply and demand. And then the two at the bottom, which are quite trendy at the moment, we've got energy storage providing flexibility, and also bearing in mind that when people talk about variability of supply with wind and solar, variability isn't something that's suddenly popped into existence as a new thing. We saw from the chart of UK demand that demand varies enormously. So we're used to coping with variability. The difference is that we've now got to cope with variability of supply, not just variability of demand. So again, a part of power system planning increasingly going forward is going to be around things like energy storage and management of demand as well as supply. And so that's why I show storage on the bottom of this particular slide. Is it renewable? It kind of depends what you're putting into it, I guess, as to how you want to consider that. You may be surprised that I've put it use the fuel, but it does. You can't use storage unless you put something into it. The fuel, if we're talking about electricity storage, is electricity. You put electricity in and you get it out, and you don't get it out at 100% efficiency. You lose a bit along the way. So again, if you're thinking about a business case, you have an operational cost that is the cost of the electricity to go in. Obviously, the key advantage of storage, especially if we're thinking about battery storage, is it's hugely flexible. It can react very quickly. There are some things that you can do actually with battery storage that are very difficult to do with other things in terms of very fast frequency response and so on within the grid. So if you start to combine some of those sources at the bottom where the flexibility was a big cross with storage, suddenly you have flexible renewable power, flexible low carbon power. And again, looking at that chart, you'd be perfectly correct to say, well, nuclear, if I'm saying nuclear is not flexible, then nuclear would benefit from storage, and it would. That's perfectly true. If you could carry on running nuclear on a steady basis, even when you didn't need the power, but you could put it into storage, then yes, I would argue that in terms of adding it into a system in a flexible manner, nuclear is as well. Nuclear proponents would be as well to be in favour of storage as would people from the wind and solar side of things. And again, the capacity factor, how often you use your storage, is all going to boil down to the business case, the money. Is when's it worth charging it up? When do you get the best price for discharging your battery? So we've spent most of our time on this one slide as a summary of kind of the things that could go into a mix, and the key takeaway is that actually they're all different. One of the discussions that often seems to come about within this whole business is, well, let's replace X with Y. Let's turn off this and replace it with this. There are really, I think there's pretty much no two of those power sources which are directly substitutable in every respect. So if you replace some things with other things, you may reduce the system flexibility unless you do other things as well, like storage, interconnection, demand management, whatever. If you replace some thermal sources with non-thermal sources, if combined heat and power is part of your mix currently, then that may affect your choices. You may decide that biomass is going to be a bigger chunk of your system, or geothermal is worth pursuing, rather than some of the non-thermal renewable sources, depending on your anything from the geography of your country to things like the import-export balance. If you're going to replace fueled power generators with non-fueled power generators, then again you might have to think about the implications of that in terms of grid that you need to build. You might need to think about it in terms of some advantages in terms of forward fuel risk and so on. There's a whole bunch of different things. Capacity factor, you'll have to think about if you replace high capacity factor with low capacity factor, how much you have to build, how much more capacity you have to build to provide the same number of units of energy over time. And with various of these things, as I say, you have to look at also storage might we have to build to return our system or to improve our system in terms of its flexibility compared to what it is now. So it's never, that's why it's really always about a mix, and it's never about just saying, okay, let's turn this one off and let's replace it with this. Very few of these things, I would say none of them, are directly substitutable in every case. They all produce electrons and can plonk it into a wire, but they do so in very different ways. We could draw other columns here. I mean, one interesting one to look at would be things like scale, distributed scale versus large centralized scale, for example. That's going to be a key issue going forwards. Off-grid usage versus centralized grid connected usage. So there are other factors we could use, but I just picked these ones out as examples to kick off with. Okay. Again, just to reiterate this point, increasingly going forwards, I would think about the power supply mix not just in terms of generators, power generators, but also as demand. Your power generating mix, you really can't separate what happens with demand from it, and that can be affected by efficiency. So if you turn off one source of generation to transition to something else, rather than try and replace exactly the same units of energy, one thing to do would be to combine that with efficiency, so that actually you can either reduce the level of growth that you're trying to meet, or in markets which we've seen in the UK, Germany and so on, you can actually reduce demand over time, which makes your task much, much easier. When we run the mini MBA and ask people to run a very simple energy mix model in Excel, they find that the task is much, much easier if you don't allow demand to just kind of keep on growing at a nice jolly rate. As well as overall demand reduction efficiency, there's also demand side response is becoming a lot more important. So that's adjusting demand for certain times of day, certain periods, particularly peak, trying to do something about peak power. Again, what that can allow you to do, particularly if you're putting less flexible power sources into your system, if your supply is becoming less flexible, then your demand side has to become more flexible, potentially to integrate those supplies into the system without doing a whole bunch of other stuff. And some of the other stuff that you could do, again, would include things like storage. The key thing about storage is actually it's not just supply, it's supply and demand. Storage can work in both directions. It can be a source of electricity, put electricity into the grid by discharging, but also it can be a source of load. It can be a source of demand. If you need extra demand, you can charge the battery up. Again, maybe by running your nuclear, even at times when demand is not very high. So this answer to this question, or the discussion around this question of the right mix, in inverted commas, it very much depends where you're starting from. So in terms of what the best kind of matrix of supply sources to put together, it depends what you have to begin with. As I say, if you've got lots of hydro in your system, it's going to be much easier to put other sources which require a dispatchable balance to them. So where you're coming from matters. What you're proposing to turn off matters. The age of the power plants you've got, the age of those resources will affect the economics of them. As I say, the geography, the grid, or how that looks, where you've got enough capacity or not, is going to make a big difference. So there's a whole bunch of stuff about where you start from, and also things like demand. What's happening to demand? It makes a massive difference when we start running power mix models and deciding what the best mix is going to be, or what works and what doesn't. It makes a huge difference as to what we start to assume in terms of demand. Is it growing? Can we keep it flat? And again, just very briefly, pop onto this slide. There are lots of different demand drivers. There are obviously things like what I've called lifestyle energy access, so more people having access to electricity, more people having 3 televisions and a fridge, whatever it may be, having more American style lifestyles, increasing population, just more people, increasing demand for cooling, and so on and so on. Costs as well. One key debate in this is how much is it all going to cost. But people often focus on cost in terms of cost per kilowatt hour, whereas I would argue what really matters to most people is what size the bill is at the end of the month, and that will tie in very much with efficiency there in the corner. What you tend to see is that if things become expensive, people use them more efficiently. If electricity is very cheap, people will, waste is probably the wrong word, but people are less careful necessarily about how they use it. So I mean, there's a lot of people criticize the cost of electricity in Germany, but actually if you look at how much electricity Germans use compared to markets where the cost is much cheaper, their bills are actually no higher. They just use it more efficiently. It's kind of the two of them go together. And then also things like substitution. And by that I mean if you start substituting heat or transport for electricity, then that has an impact on the demand you need. So if we all start driving electric cars around rather than oil, petrol, diesel powered cars, then that's going to impact our demand and also the type of resources that provide that demand. And then, of course, lots of local factors come into play here. What natural resources do you have as a country? Is energy security a big issue? I would suggest for most countries it either is or should be. Are you importing? Are you a producer? Obviously, if you're in the States and you've got lots and lots of relatively cheap shale gas available, then it makes perfect sense to use that. If you're in a country where you'd have to import lots of gas, putting your economics and your security in the hands of imports, and then competing on a global market for the price of those things, then that might be a less sensible decision. What does your economy look like? Are there certain areas of expertise that you already have that you can build on? Are there ways that you can use a new transition to boost your economy? Again, we could raise lots of different economic type issues, but jobs comes up quite frequently. If you're going to create jobs, then if you want, then ideally you want high value jobs, which means high taxes, or at least lots of tax revenue coming back. Jobs isn't just also about the direct employment, it's also the multipliers around that. So if someone is earning a fortune as a offshore wind engineer, then they also go and buy a nice car at the local car dealership and go out for a nice meal at the local restaurant. So you get spending that's kind of multiplied around the economy. Again, in what policymakers will look at is not just jobs overall, but they might be looking much more detail at where those jobs happen. Would those jobs be created in areas where they're most needed, areas of high unemployment, for example, where other industries have gone? Can you reuse skills? So if I look at the UK again, there's lots of oil and gas expertise for offshore, building offshore structures, which is starting to be used quite sensibly for building offshore wind structures. So again, can you kind of, if one industry is declining, can you use the skills and expertise on another one? And again, looking at that in terms of import, export, balance, security, and so on. Do you want to lead the world in particular technologies? Denmark in wind turbines, for example. The government here has announced just yesterday that they want to lead the world in battery technology. And then increasingly coming up are things like indirect benefits. Air quality has been a huge one recently, particularly around transport, but also in China around things like coal generation and air quality issues there, and health and so on. And then, of course, policymakers also have to think about potential downsides of any transition. So if you're choosing a new source of generation over an existing one and sort of shutting the other one down, what happens to the jobs in that one? So you may gain jobs in one sector but lose them in another sector. Is the technology and expertise for your transition, is that something that actually you end up importing? Do you end up spending money on consultants from overseas or whatever? And obviously things like we'll mention costs and so on as we go through as well. So there's a whole bunch of different economic impacts. Do you have much space? I mean, that one comes up fairly regularly. You can easily do calculations that might tell you that, I did one myself, I think I ended up that I could cover the whole of the UK's electricity demand if I just covered 4% of the land mass with solar panels. Now, 4% doesn't sound very much, but good luck trying to achieve that. It depends if the land is available. Usable space is what matters. In some markets, land might not be an issue at all. You might have huge areas of land that no one owns, that's not being used for anything else, like crops or whatever it may be. And so it's not an issue. There'll be other places where you might look as though land isn't a constraint, but when you look at the practicalities of being able to use it, it is. We've mentioned flexibility. The more flexible your system is already, and the more flexible you evolve it to become, the more you'll be able to put non-dispatchable, inflexible power sources within it. And then obviously cost, massive debate around cost. Again, I'm not going to spend any time on these, but lots of people produce charts like this. This one's from data from the US government. They were looking at levelized cost of electricity for plants entering service in 5 years' time, and you end up with ranges. So in the best conditions, lowest costs, in worse conditions, higher costs. But if I drew that chart for a different country, it would be a completely different or a very different order of things, very different sizes of costs. It depends on resources. It depends on all sorts of factors. I mean, the problem with simple metrics like that is you have to know what the assumptions are. You have to know what's gone into adding up that that cost. You also have to make sure you're not mixing up cost with price. Just because something costs something, and unit of electricity costs this much out of the power plant gate, doesn't mean that's what a consumer is going to have to pay for it. I would argue, we should be looking much more at system prices, for example. If one source looks very cheap on a levelized cost basis, but you have to build huge grid infrastructure and lots of storage to make it work, then you should really be adding that up into the overall cost, because ultimately the consumer at the end of the day will have to pay for all that. We have to think also about whether we're looking at cost now or projecting forward. So that previous one was projecting forwards. If you're building, and again, a common source of argument is people using costs that are, if not out of date already, certainly going to be out of date by the time the point they're trying to make becomes relevant. Some costs are reducing very quickly, some are going in the other direction. And again, the relevance, so again, levelized cost of energy in particular, is not something that's actually used really to predict capacity and predict specific power plants in specific locations, because that depends on so many other things. So you've got to be a bit careful about using simple cost metrics. But certainly cost is going to be a key part of the whole policy environment, and the policy environment in turn is going to have a big impact on which choices are made. So policymakers are going to worry about all these various things potentially, and depending on what their priorities are for their particular country, and depending what the current state of play is for their particular country, it will determine a different mix of those different sources we saw earlier, according to whether priorities around climate change, whether it's around keeping costs low, whether it's about increasing flexibility and decreasing dependence on foreign imports, whatever it may be. And again, they will all vary from country to country. So some of it's about the technology capability, but a lot of it is about the choices that different countries and different societies want to make. And that also obviously then all ties into whether, from a industry point of view, it's certain supplies, certain sources, certain energy mixes in certain countries are worth investing in, or going to be growth markets or not. And then just to finish off, it's how do we even judge whether we've chosen the best energy mix, or the right energy mix for our market. If we're looking at low carbon, is it how quickly we've rolled it out, how effective we've been in deploying it? That may not be the same as being efficient in deploying it. You could argue that the quickest way to roll out large capacity of renewable power is to provide a nice degree of investment attractiveness, lower down that list of things, which potentially means having relatively high subsidies and letting people get quite good returns. That probably isn't the most efficient way in terms of the cost of the delivered energy. So again, it kind of depends, but if you've rolled it out very quickly, is that a success because it's had a very immediate climate impact? It's kick-started an industry, for example, it's created lots of jobs in a very short time. Or are you looking at success being rolling it out more slowly, but at a more publicly acceptable, lower cost level? Does it fit in with the electricity market structures you've already got? Or again, is there a degree to which you start having to kind of rip some of those up and reform them? Maybe you want to do that anyway. Maybe that's a good thing anyway. So not only are there lots of factors to consider in terms of even thinking about what the right mix is going to be, but then also it's when you look back, how are you going to be judging the success of deployment? It's not just about that statement I said at the start about delivering the right amount of power at the right amount of time. In practice, in the energy market, it's going to be about a whole bunch of different things. Yes, that's the kind of base thing you've got to achieve. You've got to keep the lights on, but if you can achieve it in with a whole bunch of other outcomes as well, then those are things that certainly from a political level you're likely to be measured on. Okay, that's filled an hour. So thanks for listening. Hopefully that's given you a good sense of both kind of the energy supply issues, electricity supply issues anyway, and also if you are interested in the Renewable Energy Mini MBA that I run for Green Power Academy. Hopefully it's given you some sense of the kind of issues we delve into. Obviously that's a 5-day course, so each of the things we've talked about here we go into in a lot more detail. We play around with some energy mix, simple energy mix models, we discuss policy, we discuss project finance and so on.